Dr. Bradley, thank you for joining us. Can I ask you, first of all, why you chose to feature the skimmity ride, Strand's protest last year, on the front of your new book?
It's a really good, the image I was using was just such a vivid image. Both it conveys the the public feeling around things like urban extensions, so-called garden villages, but also in terms of the effigies that were being carried of planners and developers, and the idea that it was invoking a tradition of popular concern, of things like the beating bounds marches and stuff like that. There's a folk tradition, really, which is about attachment to place, about concern for where you live, about concern for the environment, that I think that image summed up very well, and that's one of the themes of the book.
You've written about the historical role of protest groups like Stand in the development of the planning process. Can you just explain your thinking about that?
I think it's really important for people to know that the planning system that we have in England today was created by campaign groups like Stand. I mean, quite literally so. It was the CPRE, the Campaign for the Protection of Rural England, and a Civic Voice, or Civic Trust as it was then, who wrote the entire planning framework that planning, the land use policy in Britain is still based on. And they were networks of local groups. So before there were ever planners as professional practitioners, it was volunteers and community activists who created the planning system. And they wrote all the best things in the planning policy. They created Greenbelt, they created national parks, and they wanted a planning system which was about urban containment and stopped urban sprawl. And now that's all gone.
And were they described in those days as NIMBYs?
They were not. In fact, they were incredibly influential. So planners joined those organizations, and they believed very strongly in the aims of those organizations. And the CPRE, the Campaign for the Protection of Rural England, wrote vast amounts of planning theory. So they were kind of leading the whole, they were on the cutting edge of how to regulate property development so that it actually benefited the community rather than just taking value away from the community.
So how do we today answer the charge of NIMBYism?
NIMBY is just a dirty word now. It's a completely meaningless word. And all it actually conveys is, I refuse to listen to what you're saying. I mean, that's how it's used today. And interestingly enough, the word emerged at the same time as the kind of property development industry took over the planning system. So this was back in the 1980s. But when people get involved in a development application, if they're commenting on it or if they're objecting to it, they have to reference planning policy. So they have to say, I object to this because planning policy here says, you should be conserving the environment, for instance. Therefore, planning policy conveys all the opposition that people, all the comments and all the kind of concerns that people have about development. It's already there in planning policy. So people are not acting as NIMBYs, as in preserving their selfish interests. They are using what is already in planning policy, what is there to be used. But further than that, also, that planning is a democratic service, supposed to be a democratic service. And there is a responsibility and a duty on people to get involved in things that are happening in their area. And therefore, people who are called NIMBYs are actually the best civic activists. They are doing what they're supposed to be doing, and they are key to a democratic society.
Yet they face almost everywhere where they encounter these significant development proposals, they face significant entrenched interests, the landowners and the developers who have so much at stake. You have examples of forms of protests that have been more successful than others in terms of taking on these vested interests?
I think protests such as the tactics used by Stand, are gradually having much more of an effect. I think we are reaching a point where key themes, such as that the planning system is biased in favour of landowners and developers, are gradually becoming accepted in government. So I think carry on what you're doing is the key thing. But also the problem is both national and local, and that local authorities themselves are now to some extent acting like property developers, because they're all using they need to use revenues from land development in order to pay for ordinary things. So you're on two kind of you're fighting on two fronts, which I think is very difficult. But there is no magic solution here. It takes commitment. It takes a vast amount of time and concern. And I just say, keep on doing what you're doing. I think, what you are doing there in Dorchester is fantastic.
Let's just turn to the question of affordable housing. It's often said that organisations like Stand, exclude the possibility that affordable housing should be built anywhere. It's not true, certainly on our part. But in your work on planning, what do you see as the most helpful advice you can offer people about where to site and how to develop affordable housing?
So one of the biggest lies in planning at the moment is that if you build enough market housing, full price housing, then the prices will come down. And that's the entire planning system is dedicated to that idea. So the housing targets that local authorities have to supply land to meet are based not only just on completely false household projections, but also a formula that says if you build enough houses, they'll all become affordable. That's a complete and utter lie, as we can see. And the real crisis in supply of housing is the supply of affordable housing. So all local authorities have to calculate the need. None of that is delivered. The percentage of affordable housing delivered today is minuscule. And, as you said, affordable housing is not even necessarily affordable, but it's discounted on market price. And it's all produced, or half of it is produced, by private developers themselves, who lose money on it, and so will try to make every effort using viability assessments to claim that they cannot afford to provide affordable housing. But also there's a lack of commitment from government and from local government. So for instance, they're not even calculating real housing need. There are lots of things that they just disregard in terms of homelessness, in terms of concealed households, in terms of overcrowded households. They don't count them. And so the targets for housing, affordable housing need, don't actually provide a real calculation of what we actually require. And we're not even building what they actually do calculate. So this is ridiculous. Now, actually trying to get private developers to build affordable housing is probably the wrong strategy in the first place. The only time we built enough homes for everybody was when we were building 100,000 or 200,000 council houses every year. And that takes, public grant and public borrowing. And it's financially worthwhile because it all gets paid back over a 60-year. Anybody who's got a mortgage knows that you need to borrow money to build housing. We all accept this. So why can't we do that for affordable housing, for real social housing? Because that's where the need is.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for joining us today, Dr. Bradley. Thank you.
Nigel, it's a great pleasure. And, I wish you success with the campaign.